Bam.
Hi, I'm Andy Dziengeleski, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Boom. We're working on Sunday because Russia is crazy. I mean, 24 hours ago, the end of Russia was nigh, and then never mind all that. all changes. And you just said a second ago, who's running Wagner Group? I mean, there are so many questions. Where do we begin? I guess I think the most important thing for all of us is there are nuclear weapons in play in Belarus and in Russia. Let's talk about the stable status of those weapons, and let's look forward a few months and what is a normal looking thing in the state of war. And you and I both know you don't get what you want when the war is happening, right? Like you just get what you get, and that it means everything's in play.
Right. I mean, I think if you look back to when the Russians invaded Ukraine last February, and you said, well, by June of 2023, there was going to be an armed rebellion marching on Moscow. I would assume that most people would say that doesn't meet your war aims, Vladimir, right? So to your point, once Pandora's box is open, God knows what's going to fly out of it, and that's what war does, right? And I think with your point to the control of nuclear weapons, it's like I think people are missing the number one story of this weekend, actually, which is Lukashenko left Belarus. Like, he got in a plane and flew to Turkey and is no longer the premier, whatever you want to call it, dictator of Belarus. So who's running Belarus? And why that matters is because the Russians just moved tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus. And oh, by the way, Prigozhin is now in Belarus. So what is his status? Who's running the Wagner Group, right? The Wagner Group was the most effective, and they got utterly manhandled in Ukraine on a number of occasions. But they were the shock troops for the Russian army. I mean, they're the ones who basically raised Bakhmut to the ground. So those are my two questions right now. And again, it's only 24 hours, but they seem to be pretty big questions. Are who's running Belarus? Are the nukes in Belarus secure? And what's the role of Prigozhin? And then right behind that, maybe like one delta is who's in control of the Wagner Group, right? And I haven't seen anything anywhere about any of this because everybody in the Western media is just like, it's gone from this incredible cheerleading, there's a coup d'etat going on in Russia, to, well, obviously there was some sort of agreement. What was the agreement? Prigozhin probably got bought off. As part of the deal, he would get exiled. And I think, I was, when I first saw this coming out on Friday night, I was a little bit hesitant to believe that this was a full-blown coup d'etat. Number one is that they were pretty, you've got to be close to who you're going to overthrow, right? And Wagner Group is in, mid to southern Ukraine and went through Rostov, obviously, and seized Rostov. And then they had to do like an 1,000-mile road march north to get to Moscow. And it just, something wasn't adding up here. And I started going back into the, some of the political science and political history that I studied. And I remember this very, very vague statement from years and years and years ago called an autocratic coup. And what that basically means is that it's not a coup d'etat in terms of overthrowing the head of the state. It's a coup d'etat where you keep the head of the state, but you remove some of the ministers the next level down. And to me, that seemed much more, knowing what we know about Prigozhin and his beef with Gerasimov and with Shoigu about the lack of ammunition, the lack of weaponry, the lack of recruits, everything the Russian military wasn't doing to assist Wagner. That seemed to me more likely that, his Prigozhin's, objectives were, hey, I want to be in their shoes. I want to be the guy running the show in Ukraine. Well, that didn't happen either, right? So I think that's something to keep in mind here over the next week is, where does Gerasimov land? Where does Shoigu land? Or do they stay where they're at? And I think that's the indicator. If they stay in place, then this was clearly a failed attempt, right? Because Prigozhin both didn't overthrow the state and he didn't have the success he wanted for the autocratic coup. And the people who were in control before this are still in control.
What does this all say about the strength of Putin and the Kremlin?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? It's like, again, I think there's a lot of hopeful thinking here about the stability of the Russian state. Maybe it's a little more stable than everybody thinks. Maybe there's a little bit more loyalty. The interesting thing, and we talked about Camille Galeev before in the past, and it's been interesting following him on Twitter the last few days, because what he's been saying is that it's just kind of an echo of what he said in the past, is that the Russian military isn't the premier organization for Russian people to join, right? It's like, if you want to join the government, and you want to get involved in some sort of military intelligence, you don't go in the military. You go into what's called the FSB or the FSO. And he was talking about the FSO over the weekend, which is really like this cadre of bodyguards for senior personnel. And he's like, well, this seems to me to be the place where the power is getting concentrated now, right? Is in the FSO, not the FSB, which is the follow-on to the KGB. So it's just very, very interesting. There's so many different levels and players in the game, and I'm sure people in the intel community on our side have a better grasp and a better feel of what's going on here, but that's not reaching the press, right? The press is utterly confused by what's happened, and it's just going on open source stuff. At this point, it looks like this was a half-hearted attempt at some sort of coup. Clearly did not end well for Wagner. And basically, again, from what I saw from what Putin said yesterday, it was something along the lines of like, if you were on Wagner and you were part of the coup, you're not going to be punished. We're going to forget this ever happened, right? Just go back to Ukraine and keep fighting, and we'll forget this ever happened. So again, there's what the deal that was cut here, who really knows?
Yeah.
But it's interesting, right? There's not enough meat on the bone here to say anything really definitively about what happened.
One of the things about Putin too is one, what's in the box? Like, he's got something where he can be like, do you want what's in this box? And then somebody goes, no, we do not, and because he can reach out and put nuclear things in people's underwear in any nation in the world, he can always bluff that. He can always say, this is what I'm going to do. And he's got billions and billions and billions of dollars at stake. So he can bribe, he can send nuclear fissionable material into your heart. I mean,
right.
He has got a lot of potential things he can do he's just got a lot of power, and to stay in power like that. Look, and I'm just kind of throwing things out there that he has at his disposal to stay where because it doesn't take a whole lot to throw someone over if everything's at stake, and it does seem that way. But he definitely is very, 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 very powerful to stay where he is at, and very well connected.
Right, and obviously there's some sort of loyalty there too, right?
Right.
I mean, that's the other thing is, obviously there's enough people in the regime that think enough of Putin, that think he's the guy to lead the country, that they've remained loyal to him, right? And whether that's access to power, access to money, access to influence, access to certain positions, or a combination of all the above. I mean, let's face it, look, the Indians and the Chinese are buying tons of oil and coal and natural gas from the Russians at greatly reduced prices, which means they've got a consistent income stream coming in.
Yeah.
It's just one of these things where you take a look at the battlefield losses of the Russians and you say, this isn't sustainable, and it's going to take forever for their forces to reconstitute. And that's probably true, right? I mean, there's numerous confirmed reports of T-54s and T-55s being used. And actually this week I don't know how this would work, but I saw somebody had videotaped in Ukraine a T-54 that was jam-packed to the gills with explosives and basically used as an IED. A VBIED, and it's like, okay, tank armor, even T-54 stuff is pretty strong. You're not going to get a real blast effect off of that. I'm not really sure how that would work, but okay,
Yeah.
Maybe a good idea. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I guess we're just trying things, let's try this or something.
Well, The other thing too, Pete, is what's interesting, right? Is Russia since the end of the Cold War, basically it's just an oligarchy based on mob bosses, and Putin came out of St. Petersburg, and Prigozhin was like just a nobody, right? But one of Prigozhin's bosses became close to Putin, and that's how Prigozhin this is how this whole system basically works, right? Is that you have to get access into the inner circle, and it doesn't matter what you do, right? You could be anything from you make the guy's dinner, you're a driver for him. You just have to get into that inner circle, trusted advisor, whatever. And then if you show competence, probably some ruthlessness and loyalty, you're going to get rewarded with things. So it's interesting because Prigozhin's come from nothing, and now he's exiled, probably got paid a lot of money, and then one has to think that's this. I don't know. A lot of friends have said, "Hey, well, do you think this is a pseudo operation, a false flag sort of deal?" And it's like, no, it doesn't make any sense because, if it was a false flag, you would have wanted it to last longer.
Yeah.
Right. Like after 24 hours and it stops, it doesn't make any sense. Like in the sense of like if this was a false flag and the Russians started moving, their forces out of Ukraine, right? And then, that was a trap, and then you immediately counterattack. Well, it had to last longer than 24 hours, right? This wasn't enough time to say, hey, I've got to move a couple of divisions or a corps or an army out of Ukraine and then surprise them with a counterattack when the Ukrainians attack. I don't think that's the case. I think that this was actually some sort of coup attempt, and basically Putin got in touch with Prigozhin and said, look, this is insanity. We're going to annihilate you once you get close to Moscow. I don't want that to happen. Let's come to some sort of agreement here. And it'll be interesting to see what trickles out over the next days and weeks of what that agreement actually was.
Could this just be a commander saying, hey, I'm not getting the attention I need to get the things I need to do the job that you need me to do. So pay fucking attention?
Quite possibly.
Yeah.
Quite possibly. But again, I think...
are you for me or against me? Decide now,
Sure, but again, it's one of these things that I don't think we can answer definitively because what is his role in Belarus, right? Is he completely out of the system now and he's been exiled, basically? Yeah. Or does he still have a role to play within the Russian power system, right?
Yeah.
Because if he's been exiled, then he's failed at everything. But if he was able to do this to gain power somewhere and to do something else for Russia, then that kind of makes more sense to me at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's just my speculation rather than anything concrete.
And you and I both know, no one knows. This all could.
Yeah.
When we look at this, we saw a lot of trending things on Twitter about PsyOps, and one of the things that people don't understand about any kind of psychological operations, these are multiple spheres all bumping into each other. The Americans are doing psychological operations, absolutely. The Ukrainians are. Sub-states are doing it for everybody's doing this stuff. What are your thoughts on psychological operations?
What's the objective?
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yep.
That's always the question I have is, okay, what's the objective? I don't see a clear objective for a psychological operation with this on any side.
Mm-hmm.
It just the only thing it does is muddy the waters even more, right? It's like, and then I think that's what's bad for Russia is that now people are going to perceive Russia as being more unstable than it was. And I don't know if that's the case or not, right? We just don't know at this point. But it seems like the Russian state has some cracks in its facade. And that's bad, right? Because it's the world's largest nuclear arsenal. It's the world's largest biological arsenal. And, you saw what happened in Iraq when we didn't secure warehouses full of conventional ammunition that basically led to an insurgency that lasted for a better part of a decade. So, you absolutely positively don't want the Russian state to lose control, because you're also talking about a 6,000-mile state, from the Lithuanian border out to the Far East.
Yeah.
And they've got these sites scattered to the four winds. And, so getting back to the PsyOp piece, I don't understand what the PsyOp is. I don't understand it from the US/Western side. I don't understand it from the Ukrainian side. And I don't understand it from the Russian side. Again, I just think that this was a power play, and it's interesting. I think you may be right. This may have been like the last desperate cry of a commander who was not getting the men materiel support that he thought he was warranted by the Russian military leadership, and that this was his last desperate cry to say, "Okay, you guys aren't listening to me. The hell with you."
Yeah.
I think when all this pans out, like, we're going to look back in this and I think we're going to kind of laugh on why this happened, right? It's probably going to be something very simple and I think it's going to be something very simple, and to our eyes, it's going to be almost sad. Like, this is how bad off they are, right? And again, I think the thing to watch for this week, the big thing, right, is if Gerasimov and Shoigu, who are the two senior generals on the Russian general staff, if they remain in place, if Gerasimov and Shoigu are moved out and retired, exiled, get a sudden case of lead poisoning, have a trip down the stairs, fall out of an open window, then that seems to me like that may, if there was a PsyOp, maybe that's it, right? That this was all staged by Prigozhin and Putin to get rid of those two guys, right? Because then at least you have this, then you have an excuse of saying, well, the Russian military couldn't even defend against a coup d'etat. And now you have a rationale for getting rid of both of them.
Yeah.
I'm stretching, dude, right? I mean, this is like Dune, the movie Dune, or the book Dune, right? There's plans within plans within plans.
Yeah, I was about to say, because they all have their people on the inside. They all got their Petes that are in the other units that are like, hey, here's what's going on. Here are the meetings that are happening. And if you're out fighting on the front line as a commander and you're not quite getting enough stuff, you are starting to wonder what game is being played against you and who's positioning against you when this is all over, and there's things being,
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the interesting thing here is like, our military and our personnel system hinders this to a great deal. But at the end of the day, it's built on trust. I can trust the people above me. I can trust the people on my left and right flanks. I can trust the people behind me. Well, there's a lot of militaries in the world, especially in autocratic systems, where that trust is, you may have individual trust between you and a person, but you don't have that collective or organizational trust that's baked in, and there's always this sparring going on for, power and primacy. It's interesting. I don't know. I'm telling you, when all this washes out, it's going to be fascinating, because I don't think anybody has any idea what just happened.
And as soon as you think you've got a grasp on it, and this is not my area, like, I don't know these characters very well, but I know that as soon as you think you've got a grasp on it, some other very smart person who spent his life studying some other angle of this is like, don't forget Bob. Bob is a Russian Ukrainian guy, who's got this long lineage of both sides, and you're like, oh my God, mind blown. This guy's playing both sides against the middle, and there's just, it's very complex, to say the least.
Right. And I mean, and the other thing that was interesting was when Putin came out yesterday and started making, broadcasts to the nation, he referenced 1917, which is the Russian Civil War, right? Yeah. And he starts talking about how, the great powers of the West, United States, Great Britain, and France, were actively involved against subverting the communists in 1917 and 1918. And that's true, right? I mean, we were. I mean, we a lot of people don't know this, but we put two infantry regiments into Russia in 1919 and 1920. One was up in the Trans-Siberian Railroad out in the middle of Siberia, and the other one was up around Archangel in the north. And so him referring to that, he's portraying this as part of a larger conflict. It's the West against Russia, right? The West was behind this. The West was behind all this. The reason why the Russian state is having problems isn't because of anything we're doing. It's because of everything that the West is doing to us. If we just didn't have the West to worry about, this Ukraine matter would be over and done with, and everyone would be fat, dumb, and happy. Of course, it's not the case, but that's what he's talking about. That's the propaganda message he's putting out. And again, it's like I remember before the Russians invaded, and I was still in uniform at the time. I was telling anybody who would listen, it's like the day the Russians invaded was a great patriotic day, or praise to the Red Army Day, something like that. The Russians really care about historical dates. Like it matters a hell of a lot more to them than it does to us.
Yeah.
And sure enough, that night, man, that's when the war started. And so that's always another thing to keep in mind here is like, okay, what are the major Russian historical dates that are coming up, like maybe in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and see how the Russian state is acting, because that will actually, strange as it sounds, right, that actually plays into their decision calculus.
Yeah, that's interesting, because so often we analyze based on that, like for Iraq, and it'd be nothing. They're like, this imam died on this day, and you're like, come on, man, like we're stretching. But I think you're right about that with the Russians. I suppose that there's another thing with this too, is you look at our behavior towards this, and it's interesting, maybe only tangentially so, but you have declared presidential candidate and Robert Kennedy Jr. saying, hey, why aren't we following the Minsk Accords? We've talked about the Minsk agreements, and his saying, hey, I want this to be over. I want to go back to this agreement. We already agreed on this. This is what I would do. I'd broker this peace and go forward. And Putin has to be listening to that going, shit, I might take that deal. If this guy gets elected, and I don't know what kind of influence he would have to do that, either of those guys, but there are other things that are out there long-term, looking a year or two down the line, that maybe everybody is looking at.
Yeah, but that's a long way away, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're still in the middle of a bloody war where the Russians have lost over 200,000 dead and wounded. Who knows how many the Ukrainians have lost? I've heard numbers just thrown around where the Russians have lost 80 to 90% of their tank fleet that existed prior to the war. Take everything with a grain of salt, of course, but they've suffered significant losses. But it's looking forward to the U.S. presidential elections in 24, which is really January of 25, the transfer of power. I mean, it's still 18 months away.
Too far.
Right?
Okay.
I think it's wishful thinking to think that some sort of transition of power within the United States is going to have much effect. It might. It's too early. It's way too early to get into that game, because I think that the Ukrainians have not started their offensive yet, right? I still think they're conducting preparation of the battlefield for the offensive. Last week there were a number of reports of them using storm shadow strikes to basically rubble bridges or put holes into bridges, leading to Crimea. From what I've seen, just again, this is all open source. They may have committed 3 or 4 brigades. They probably have 30 or so left in reserve, which are probably their main strike force, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they've got, let's see, what is it, June 25th today? You've got about 3 months left of solid campaigning season. Like once you start getting into October, that's when it starts snowing and it starts raining heavily, and you get back into the mud season, the fall mud season. So I think they have to do something. If you ask me today, they're going to do something within the next 3 weeks, because they kind of have to, right? Because I think what you want to do is, like, you want to have a couple, just thinking as a planner again, I want to have 2 or 3 phases of a plan that I can execute this summer, right? I want to have my prep phase. I want to have my major combat operations phase, and then I want to have some sort of consolidation phase where I can consolidate my gains. And so what I kind of think is, for this year, I think there's kind of 3 outcomes that I've been looking at in my mind. Is the first one is there's a decisive Ukrainian victory where they take back most, if not all, of the ground that they lost last year. And I think at that point, the Russians will have been attrited enough where they're going to have to sue for peace, right? I also think that's highly unlikely. On the flip the coin over, and the second scenario is that the Russians have a decisive victory. I think that's even more unlikely, so I don't even want to go into what that looks like. And then the third, which I think is the most likely, is there's some minor Ukrainian victories. There might be one or two even major victories, but it's not decisive enough, and the Russians aren't attrited enough where they can still have a force in the field, and you're basically looking at the war stretching into 24. That's when I think, we get into, because again, what did we see this winter, right? This winter, basically from November through April and May, it was basically Sitzkrieg, right? The phony war. Remember that term, the phony war from World War II? I think we've had a bit of a phony war stage here, and it's just really interesting to see that how this culminates this year. I just can't come to a logical conclusion on a decisive victory this year for either side. I really see the war stretching into 24. And then the question becomes, because wouldn't this be ironic, right, is that if this war is still ongoing during the summer of 24 into the presidential election season, one has to assume that we've had, additional aid packages to Ukraine in the number of tens of billions by that point. Then it becomes a real issue in the presidential election, right? And then the question is, are the American people tired of this? Are the American people tired of having to send $100 billion to the Ukrainians right after we've spent $3 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 years?
Yeah.
Right. It's going to be an issue regardless if this war's still going on. I don't know.
Yeah.
And maybe RFK Jr. is the guy to bring it to the forefront. I don't know. I heard a rumor, by the way, that his vice is going to be Tulsi Gabbard.
It's that's a bold move, and he gets
a ticket, isn't it?
he gets to be bold, and this is not a political show about him, but he gets to make his calls, and that's a bold one. The call to do that, to go, if this administration continues to go to the bank for tens of billions of dollars, for what? They have to answer that question, and that's a tough ask, over and over again.
Yeah, it's a tough ask when the housing market in this country is pretty much dead, right? It's the lowest number of mortgages like in the last 10 years that have been let. You've got mortgage rates that are reaching 7% now. The Fed's talking about 2 more interest rate hikes this year.
Yeah.
So inflation really isn't under control. So, obviously the economy is going to be the number one issue during the presidential election. It can very easily, if the Ukraine war is still going on, get tied into what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, right? It's, $100 billion is a lot of money by any standard, even in DC.
Yeah. And you and I both know from history, land speculation, boy, that stuff causes really, really bad economic downturns.
Yeah. Well, not as bad as the Dutch tulip craze, but bad enough, right?
Yeah. So let's get focused back on Ukraine and Russia, and what do we want to happen? Do you think? I mean, look, obviously we want Russia to lose, but why and how badly? And again, what do the Russians think about all that?
I think there's two strategic end states that the foreign policy establishment wants out of Russia. One, I think, is preferred over the other. I think the more radical folks want a collapse of the Russian state that they can kind of help rebuild and kind of set on a modernization path. Again, I think that's highly unlikely and highly dangerous. I think the more cautious and maybe more realistic folks want simply the Russians to buy into a Western rules-based order, right? Where the Russians adapt to international norms, where they open up their markets to the world, where they become globalized. I mean, if you listen to Putin's speeches over the last 3 to 5 months, he's always talking about the globalists and how the Russians are going to resist the globalists. right? So there's definitely that part at play here as well, because what that does is, number one, it crushes the oligarchs, right? And number two is that a lot of those raw resources and that the actual funds, don't stay in Russia. They're going to go to other places. They're going to go to Wall Street. They're going to go to London. They're going to go to Tokyo, to other, finance hubs around the world. And then there's another part of this too, right? I mean, the Russian economy is a fossil fuel based economy, and they got a metric ton of it, right? Got an absolute bundle of natural gas.
Yeah.
Got an absolute bundle of coal. Got an absolute bundle of oil. Although their oil the easy oil is about out. Everything else is up in the Arctic or in Siberia, where it's really difficult to extract and very expensive to extract. So, there's that at play as well. But I think in a perfect world, everybody would be happier if Putin is disposed of some way. His cronies are taken care of in some way, and then there's some sort of, and again, this is very, we can't look through this through a Western perspective, but somebody who's a little more Western leaning, a little more liberal, a little more willing to buy into the Western, rules-based internationalist state of affairs and world order. I think that's the best case scenario. Now, do I think that's going to happen? Maybe. I mean, I was having dinner last night with a relative of mine, and he was talking, what happens next? And I said, well, you have to understand that sometimes you might, what comes after Putin is what he asked me. And I said, well, there's always the downside, which is you have somebody far worse.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Somebody who might be willing to use nukes, somebody who might be, because, I mean, that's the weird thing about Russia, through its history, they've always responded to a strongman. What happens if you have a 21st century Ivan the Terrible emerge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. What happens if you have a 21st century Peter the Great emerge?
Yeah.
It's there's always, there can always be worse past Putin. Right. So you just have to balance that out and not be too positive about this. You would hope to be, but look what the Russian state is. Look what the Russian state has been for the last 30 years. Is it even realistic to hope that somebody like that emerges out of the system?
And I don't want to be crass, but if they had a Trudeau step up and say, I'm going to run Russia, that guy's alive for 8 seconds, and he just gets decapitated on TV, and the strong man shows up again. Because you're 100% right. Russia wants a strong man. They don't want to be stepped on. And by the way, Russia's not that big. And so when we have all these desires to get them into line, they don't want to be in line. And this is just the Pete theory. But when we look at the theory of money rips around the world at the speed of light because it's all digital now. And these oligarchs are black holes, and they hold on to money in a way that benefits at least some Russians. And if they lose these black holes, money just whips around, and then you can legislate money away from areas. Nobody in Russia wants that. And so, it's almost like it doesn't matter what Russia does. So they're damned if they do. And so they're just going to do what they want to do. And that's just, I'm not an economist. I'm a combat spy who doesn't even do that anymore. So I don't know, but I can understand their point of view of like, hey, you guys have lied to us about NATO. And so we're just going to do what we want to do for as long as possible, because what's the cost?
And even within Russia too, right? I mean, the two centers of gravity within Russia are Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's where the money lies, right? And what's interesting is if you take a look at the Russian casualty lists, the two lowest districts where the casualties are from are Moscow and St. Petersburg.
That's right.
Why? That's where the old Soviet nomenclatura, which was 300,000 people who ran the Soviet Communist Party, like that still exists. It's not called that, obviously, but you still have this nomenclatura that's based around St. Petersburg and Moscow. And, things have to be pretty bad for the state to call their sons and daughters into action to serve the state. And so, it's kind of like, what was it? I think it may have been Bismarck, this isn't worth the life of one Pomeranian grenadier, that's the feeling in Moscow. You know, Ukraine's not worth the life of one infantryman from St. Petersburg. So, I mean, Russia's a huge country, but there's a whole lot of nothing in between a lot of their cities, and man, it's fascinating. It is such a fascinating country. It's just I don't know. I mean, it's just like, I mean, I want to go back all the way to what you said in your introduction, right? It's like Pandora's boxes have been opened.
Yeah.
Right? It's like no one knows what Russia's going to be 5 years from now.
Yeah. And then let's go back to what you said is for the hardliners that want to topple Russia and take out Putin, the grass is not greener. Look, we are not good at that. We are not good at getting to reliably. We're reliably good at taking that person down. We are not good at the rest of it after that. You know, sure, we can go kick that person out of office and make them not be in charge, but anything after that, who knows what happens?
Pete, let's just look at it from a military perspective. Let's forget the politics and the foreign policy and the
Sure.
economic for a second, right? If the Russian state collapses and you've got thousands of nuclear weapons that are scattered to the four winds, and thousands of biological weapons that are scattered to the four winds, and thousands of chemical weapons that are scattered to the four winds, like we couldn't even properly occupy Iraq.
Yeah.
Right, with all our allies.
The size of Texas, by the way.
Right, and so now you're talking about the world's largest country with, you know, thousands, if not 10,000, tens of thousands of these sites for WMD. Okay, well, who exactly is going to go in and secure all that stuff?
Yeah.
Right? You know, it's just mind-boggling to think that this is a really good idea where you want Russia to fall apart and somehow there's going to be, you know, 30 different new countries that emerge from the wreckage.
Yeah. And you know who knows how to run Russia the best and like keep people from doing a bunch of Sherman bow ties, because you need the rail system to run that country. Big news here. It's the Russians. They know how to take care of it. They know how to keep the Chechens in line. They know how to do all that stuff. And if you don't let them.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, but you said something really interesting, you know, getting back to what happened yesterday and Friday, right?
Yeah.
The Chechens actually pledged their support to the Russian state.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. What's his name? Roman Kadyrov basically came out on Twitter and said, "We're here to help crush this mutiny. We're loyal to Moscow."
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, they fought two really bloody wars in Chechnya in the 90s, right? That's pretty fascinating to hear now the Chechens are kind of like the vassals of Putin, right?
Yeah. What do you make of the Chechen, independent state that's over there? Like, what do you make of those people?
Well, they know how to fight.
Yeah.
When we first went into Afghanistan back in, late 2001, like I know the first people we targeted were the Chechens who were aligned with Al-Qaeda, because we knew they had a bundle of combat experience. We knew that they were tough as nails.
Mm-hmm.
Remember what Stalin did to the Chechens, right? He took the whole damn ethnic group and threw them into Siberia. So these are not people to be trifled with. And
or given access to nuclear weapons.
Yeah, right. I mean, thank God there are so few of them, right? I mean, it's a relatively small region, but these are some tough hombres. And I know it was interesting. There's some weird stuff going on early in the year. Like part of there was like a Chechen legion that was fighting for the Russians, and some of them defected over to Ukraine, and then they defected back to the Russian side. So it's like, obviously these are people you can rent, but you should have known on buying them.
Right. So, yeah.
It's just the longer this lasts, man, it just gets more and more fascinating. The history of this war is going to be unbelievable.
There's a lot of people that have made their career studying the region, whether it's Russia versus Ukraine, everything, and everybody's got their baby, and so you see all these different, like, this is what's going to happen. And it's all too desperate, and we're all just too precious with our babies. What are your thoughts? How do we suss out what we see? I mean, I'm talking people with PhD in front of their name, right? We're talking about a lot of smart people. How do we know what to think? How do we suss out the opinions and the very well credentialed people?
I think you look at the experts, because they do have a lot of education and experience, right? I mean, there isn't you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because you have one or two of these people who make bad predictions. Now, if they make bad predictions consistently, Thomas Friedman with his, Iraq will turn over in 6 months and everything will be great. It's like, yeah, okay, you lost your credibility a long time, Tom.
Right.
But look at them and instead of looking at opinion, take a look at the facts. Take a look at the facts as best they're presented. What do we know concretely? And that's really hard now because, the Ukrainians are extremely good at suppressing information. The Russians are extremely good at suppressing information.
Right.
So what I have friends of mine hit me up all the time. They're like, "What's the truth?" And I'm like, "I wish I could tell you. I don't know." I mean, I'm just as much as in the dark as you are. But when I do that, my rule of thumb is let's look at the facts as they're presented, right? And sometimes the facts aren't right either, so you got to take that with a grain of salt. But it's like there's certain truths, right? We know the Russians have taken an absolute beating. Right, they've lost a lot of men. They've lost a lot of material. We know the Ukrainians have taken a beating. They've lost a lot of men and most of their old equipment. Right, there's a reason why we poured in $50 billion worth of equipment into them. Right, we know that the Ukrainians have been successful, and that the Russians have been a bit of a paper tiger, at the tactical level. And that's really, other than that, I think then you just get into speculation. And really quickly, it's like you just take a look at the battlefield facts and go from there. But when it comes to what are the Russian war aims? What are the Ukrainian war aims? Like, are the Ukrainians really serious about retaking Crimea? I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe. I know that was if you go back to the last, forgetting about 2014 with the Russian special operation that retook Crimea, which was actually really brilliant. But if you take a look at the last conventional invasion of Crimea, which was in 1942 by Manstein and the Germans and Romanians, that was not an easy fight. The terrain down there is absolutely brutal. It's a mountainous and swampy isthmus, right? And there's only two ways that you can really get in there. You can get in there from the east through the Kerch Peninsula, and you can get down. I forgot what what is it called? Paracop, I think. Paracop is isthmus on north to south, and that's only 8 miles wide. And there's 2 rail lines, and it's all swamp. I mean, are the Ukrainians serious about doing that? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, most of the people down there, when they're polled, they feel that they're Russian. They don't feel like they're Ukrainian.
Right. And what folks don't understand, if they've not been somewhere that's hard, rugged, impermissible in terms of just the terrain, like Afghanistan, why is it so hard to win there? Because there's every single kind of rock on your trail, from 50-foot boulders to pea gravel, and you have to traverse across all of it at any given time, and you have vehicles. I saw this great briefing one time, and you'll appreciate this. This is a brigade briefing, and they were so proud of this squad because they had a Humvee with a tick on the back. A tick it's like a camper shell, everybody, really heavy camper shell, and it fell over. And they self-recovered. It took them 18 hours. They had ratchet straps and a rock, and they were like, these guys had stick-to-itiveness. Forget the mission; it never happened. But the mission was to get this thing back up on it. This is how hard it is to move. You're physically. You ever want to see how hard it is to move? Read Michelle Black's story about the SF team that got ambushed out in Africa, and how hard it is to move through camel grass. All these things.
Yeah,
you understand what it means to move through mud. I was in Bosnia. You would walk and you would see the 5 tons peeling mud over their axles and over their differentials, and you try to move supplies and people through that stuff. It's exhausting. It breaks things. It's just, it's impossible. And so when you see that, you realize, wow, you have to really, really want that, because it breaks things, it kills people, everything. The other thing I was going to say is 82 years ago this week, Operation Barbarossa started, right? And
that's right.
If we know one thing about the Russians, going back to let's look at the facts. We know that I saw a great quote about Evander Holyfield many years ago. And he's got a chin like granite, right? And so the person said, you could drop a safe on his head and he will smile, and the Russians, you can absolutely kick the shit out of them, but They will. You can throw everything you want. We're going to throw. We have thrown billions of modern technology at them, and there they are. They can take it. So until someone proves that they can whoop those guys, they
Right.
are not.
And you can say what you want, but yeah, I mean they're tough people, right? And
Yeah.
Sure, their invasion did not go as planned, but
Yeah.
they'll hold a lot of territory that they didn't hold before, February of last year.
Right. Right.
And it was interesting. I was there's a great show on YouTube. It's called World War II, and it's World War II
Mm.
Weekly.
Mm.
Really, really interesting. I think it's run by a Canadian, but it's great maps. And they were talking about the other thing that happened this week in 1944, which was Operation Bagration,
Mm.
the big Soviet offensive in the east 3 weeks after we landed in Normandy. And he quoted one of the German field marshals that said the Soviets aren't attacking the same way on a wide front as they normally do. They basically copied the German stormtrooper tactics by using small teams of infantry and engineers supported by a heck of a lot of artillery to break through the line. And then they just massed their armor forces to exploit and get into the rear. And then it was game on, right? Then you're off to the races. So to your point, it's like, what I would expect is both the Ukrainians and the Russians for their tactics to start changing. But it's different, and it's different. It's way different than World War II because you still have like near persistent surveillance, right? You've got drones up in the air all the time, right? Everything from the tactical ones to the more, to the larger ones that can fire, missiles off of them, and even drop bombs off of them. But you have electronic warfare. It's like and then you said the sheer explosive power of modern weaponry and the precision guided munitions, and it's like, how much can infantry tactics and armor tactics and those frontline tactics actually change now when you are under persistent surveillance, where you have really a one shot, one kill capability, whether that's from an indirect fire apparatus,
Right.
Or or like a javelin missile. It's like we can kill. Javelins are unbelievable weapons. Like, it's one shot, it flies out, it's fire and forget, right? And it's going to hit that. And if it's in top attack mode, that turret's going to pop off and fly 500 yards.
Yeah.
Right?
It's so crazy.
Yeah, I keep waiting for this next evolution of tactics to occur, and that has happened in artillery. The Ukrainians have done some really, really interesting things with artillery tactics, and I keep waiting for that to happen with the maneuver tactics, and I'm not seeing it yet. Right, and I'm just wondering, it's like, is that persistent surveillance and the electronic warfare and the infrared capabilities to pick up on body heat and low light and darkness, has that have we kind of stalemated ourselves into a position where maneuver tactics can't really change that much right now?
Yeah.
Like, the technology is actually so dominant, like there's no way to hide from those sensors.
Right. It's also amazing just in general. I always talk about the democratization of warfare, and people are trying to do this, and so maybe it's not 100% applicable, but people are doing sniper type shooting 5-mile targets, 2.5-mile targets regularly. And you don't have to hit something. You just got to bang, hit like anywhere near them. Like, hey, someone's shooting at us, and you will instantly button up and go, who's shooting at us and where it's, and if it's from 2.5 miles away, it's going to take you a minute to figure out what it is, and if you shoot and scoot, a sniper, it's dangerous to be a sniper, everybody, really bad. This counter sniper measures, but it does change how the unit operates, and it slows them down. And
well, the
so
Russians,
even
going back to World War II again, the Russians had, at the start of the war, even, they had 20 millimeter anti-tank rifles. Where they were two-man teams. And they had
how do you shoot that thing?
Right, and I think they actually they may have even gone up to over the 30s by the end of the war. But to your point, it was like, hey, if I can take a two-man team with maybe just pick an odd number of rounds, 40 rounds of 20 Mike,
Yeah.
and I can go hit. I can up a 20 millimeter round will kill any sort of soft vehicle. Like
Right.
it'll hit. You can take out a truck. You can take out a command vehicle. You can take out. I mean, at that time, right? So to me, it's interesting because the Russians have always been big into sniping, and they had large anti-tank rifle forces in World War II throughout the war, and maybe it's just a logical extension for them to shoot large caliber rifles. I mean, because for us, to my knowledge, and again, I'm not an infantryman, so to me, the largest thing we have in the arsenal is the Barrett, the 50 cal.
Yeah, and that's big. I mean, that's that thing, but that's not a 20 or a 30. Right. I can't even imagine what that does to your body when you shoot something like that. I mean,
the recoil's got to be insane. But
it's just insane.
This is just another. I keep going back to your statement about Pandora's box because I think that's the most important thing. Like on a strategic level, what people who listen to this have to understand, like when you get propagandized. And you are the recipient of propaganda, and it doesn't matter what country you're from and who the political leader is. When you talk about war, politicians are always going to say this: it's going to be a short, bloodless war.
Right.
Most of the time, it's not going to be a short, bloodless war. And the problem with this last 48 hours is that it's made a confusing situation far more confusing, and it's opened up bigger cracks and bigger questions like, who in God's name is in charge of the Russian nukes in Belarus? Who is running Belarus? Who's running the Wagner Group? What's the Wagner Group's role? Right? Are Shoigu and Gerasimov still going to be in power running the Russian military by the end of this week? There's so many questions that and very serious and very scary questions that have to get answered, because right now when you get into these phases where you don't have good control of a situation, they're the most dangerous, right?
Yeah. Can we dump some Polish potatoes into our stew here real quick? Because if I see this much chaos going on, and I know the Poles have no problem not liking the Russians and basically Belarus too, how do we keep them in check? And look, it's like the Israelis, right? Like, hey, all this chaos is going on around us. We've got to take care of ourselves. We don't trust any of these guys. I mean, at some point, Poland's got to be like, stand back. We're going to take this opportunity to create more buffer for ourselves. I mean, they're ready. They're not afraid of doing this.
Yeah, I think, like, if this war was in 2030, like what the Poles have done over the last 2 years, and this has flown very much under the radar. By 2030, the Poles will have the strongest army in Europe, which is an absolutely unbelievable thing to say. They've got a good deal of combat experience from Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, that's starting to fade out, like everybody else's is. But the Poles have bought, I want to say in the number was, I think they maybe 500 to 600 Abrams, right? Yeah. And it's the most modern variant. It's the M1A3, M1A4 variant. They bought 900 K2A2 tanks from South Korea.
Right.
So right there, you're talking about 1,500, give or take.
Yeah.
New main battle tanks. Well, okay. Well, an American Armored Division, rough order of magnitude is about 300. So you're talking about 2 armored corps.
Right.
They bought a bunch of Korean infantry vehicles, right? Infantry carriers, not like 113s, but actual like Bradley-esque fighting vehicles to go into that armored corps. They bought an absolute ton of Apaches. They're buying Western fighter bombers and fighters. They're buying Patriot. They're buying artillery. And they actually have very good Polish artillery. Actually, by some people, and again, not an artilleryman, but by some people who I trust and know, they say that actually the Polish artillery right now is as good as anything the West can produce.
Wow.
Here's the problem with all that. It's not there yet.
Mm.
right? So if this was 2030 and they had all this stuff on the ground and they've had the time to integrate the new equipment and train collectively to do it, it would be a much different story. I think the Poles are still sitting there and they absolutely have buffered up their defenses on the Polish Belarus border. They're not there yet.
Mm.
They still have a few more years to start getting all this equipment in and getting their folks trained on it. So I think the 2030 to 2050 era in Poland is going to be fascinating to watch. We pretty much have a permanent base in Poland now. The U.S. Fifth Corps Forward is there, so we have a Corps headquarters there. We're doing a lot of training in Poland, so I think it's going to be interesting to see what the Poles do post 2030. They're just not ready now. They just don't have all the stuff that they want. Now, of course, like 3 weeks later, because everything else is so screwed up in the world, you'll see the Poles invade Belarus, right?
Totally, yeah. I was just gonna ask you to grab some darts and throw them, and that's great that you did that, because I was just, let's just say that 3 months from now, the Russian-Ukrainian thing is over. Who is the person that brokers this peace?
Wow, that's a great question. Somebody that we won't expect.
Okay.
Right, because it has to be somebody that's acceptable to both the West and to Russia.
Right.
God, boy, that really narrows it down, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I can't even think of who would be that one person or where that one person would come from to be the mediator in all of this. But that's the important thing, right? It's like
Right.
we talked about the last time I was on a few months ago, right? It's like the last thing you want is to have a bad piece out of all of this.
Right. Yeah. Who's the off-ramp builder?
Right. And, I don't know. Again, I don't think it's going to happen now. I think this war is going to drag into 24.
Yeah. Yeah.
If not longer. And then I think, who knows?
When this whole thing started, I think, I don't remember what the number was, but I think I said to you, like, it'd be better to cut a $2 trillion check and just give it to each of them, and just say, here you go. Let's just not fight and just like buy our way out of it. The other thing is, and I know we talked about this also when, and I'm going to be a little critical of the Biden administration, but just set that aside a little bit. If we're going to act like we care about the environment, wars are horrible for the environment. I mean, we're destroying, like, the amount of carbon, the amount of pollution that goes into this, like all this stuff. It's hard to swallow.
Let's forget about that for a second. Right?
Okay, good. All right.
I think you're hitting on something that's interesting that some people are thinking about, what most people aren't thinking about, is how much are the reconstruction costs going to be in Ukraine?
A quadrillion. I don't know. Like,
right, because it's like you got to do demining. You got to, you got to do the. Hell, there's parts of northern France and Belgium that are still off limits 110 years after World War I ended, right? So it's like, you get to do demining. You've got to, find out where all the dud artillery shells are at. You've got to find out, where any sort of contaminants are, and that
water table pollution.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the lead poisoning of the groundwater.
Yeah,
and then you've got to rebuild roads, you got to rebuild highways, you got to rebuild rail lines. Then you talk about the agricultural piece, because then you talk about the mining piece, and then you talk about the urban infrastructure piece. Because I'm not sure how. I think Kharkov has been hit pretty heavily, especially Kyiv, but I know Kharkiv has been hit hard. So it's like, the dams, right? The Russian detonation of the dam. You're gonna, do you really want to rebuild that and create this giant reservoir on the Dnieper, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not. Well, I'll tell you what, that dam, when it was built in 19 whatever, was a hell of a lot cheaper than it's going to be in 2020 whatever.
Yeah. 4.7 million BTUs of energy to make a cubic yard of concrete.
Wow.
Just like, it blows your mind. And guess what? It's going to take a lot of concrete to fix all the stuff that's been blown up, and so you think about that
and
cost.
To smelt steel, and to smelt aluminum, and to refine plastics.
Yeah. It is an enormously expensive thing. to fix, you know. And
And the other thing I read a couple weeks ago is apparently the Russians have placed large amounts of explosives in the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. Right, so it's like, the the fossil fuel emissions may be small potatoes compared to like some sort of radiological contamination that we might have to deal with.
Yeah. That's crazy. Well, listen, I've had you for an hour on Sunday. Is there anything else you want to add? We've covered a lot of ground, but it's all been fascinating.
I think it's just very interesting that this is just another knuckleball in a war that has had a number of them thrown already, and it doesn't make the end any closer. It doesn't make the outcome any more clear. It just muddies the water a great deal more. By no means do I think that this is a benefit to the Russians. I think this is a bad sign for the Russians. Maybe it's a harbinger of things that come as the war progresses and things continue not to go well for them. But we got to kind of temper that a little bit, right? It's like, yes, this was interesting to say the least. It was a step in the right direction for the West, seeing the Russians fight themselves, but it didn't turn out the way we thought it was going to turn out. So it's like, I always go back to the movie The Longest Day, which is a fantastic movie. And, the Russians or the Americans, we invade Normandy, and they go over to a shot of Gerd von Rundstedt, who was the German commander in France, and he's out there in the garden pruning his roses, and he's like, the first reports in war are always wrong, right? So it's kind of like what happens again yesterday. It's like the first reports are always wrong. Give it 48 hours, and we'll have a better handle on what actually is going on here. But no one ever learns that, right? Everybody wants to be Johnny on the spot and make some gigantic proclamation about the importance of this or that. And more often than not, they just have egg on their face. So the war's not going to end because of this. It's going to continue to roll. And I think the next steps to look for are, what actually comes out of this within the Russian power structure, what happens in Belarus, who ends up ruling Belarus. And then, look for the Ukrainian offensive to start sometime in the next 3 weeks.
All right, man. Thanks. Let me roll these credits. Stand by.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by